Good morning and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Kori, and I have the privilege of leading the Foreign and Defense Policy team, two of the most sparkling voices of which you all get to hear this morning, Zack Cooper and Hal Brands. Zack is a senior fellow here. He's the co-chair of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. He hosts a fabulous War on the Rocks podcast called Net Assessment. He teaches at both Princeton and Georgetown, and his expertise is on China and alliances, which makes him the perfect person to critique this important new book from Hal Brands. Hal is the Henry Kissinger Chair at Johns Hopkins University. He's the most damnably prolific applied history strategist in the business, and we would all be tempted to murder him were he not such an outstanding and generous colleague, and also exploring the most important questions about the preservation of an international order that has kept the United States and so many other countries largely safe and increasingly prosperous in the last 70 years. Hal's excellent book is called The Twilight Struggle, and we are going to spend the next hour talking about it. Hal, why don't you get us started by telling us a little bit about the book before we start firing on you?
I look forward to it, and I'm happy to do so. And thank you, Kori, for hosting us, and thanks to AEI as well for putting this on. And thanks especially to Zack, who came by my office the other day and told me that since he had actually read the book prior to this event, I really owe him now, which I guess is fair enough. And so I'm not going to do a long presentation or anything on the book. I think I'm just going to try to offer a few framing comments. Then we can get into just sort of a back and forth on the history or the current policy or whatever people think is interesting. And maybe I'll start just by explaining what the title means for those who have not spent a career looking at Cold War history in the way that some of us less fortunate souls have. And so the term, the Twilight Struggle, it comes from a speech that John F. Kennedy gave in 1961, where he used the twilight metaphor to describe the Cold War. And it was apt because twilight, of course, is neither day nor night. It's sort of in the murky middle. And the Cold War was neither really war nor peace, at least as Americans had traditionally understood those things. And so it wasn't a big great power hot war in the way that World War I or World War II had been, even though there were plenty of hot wars within the Cold War in Korea and Vietnam and other places. But it certainly wasn't peace either. And so the Cold War required the United States to do things that it had never done in peacetime before, creating a large standing defense and intelligence establishment, for instance, anchoring a web of alliances stretching around the globe. And so this was like nothing else in the American experience up until that point. It certainly didn't resemble what Americans traditionally thought of as peace and thus the metaphor. And I think it's an apt one for the problems that we face today as well. And so given what's in the news, I think it's no surprise for our listeners to hear that the United States finds itself again in twilight struggles vis-a-vis China as well as Russia. These are competitions over the shape of the international order in the years to come. They implicate really important American interests. And while they are not, fortunately, hot wars at the moment, they are conducted in the shadow of war and under the threat of war, which seems to be rising both in Eastern Europe and the Western Pacific at the moment. And they feature all sorts of nasty competition short of the threshold of war, intelligence operations, hard-edged diplomacy, you name it. And so we really find ourselves in a position that is not unprecedented in our history. It's another round of great power competition. So there are lots of books, I think, about how the United States can best handle its relationships with China and Russia today. And I'm sure that there will be a lot more that will be written on this subject in the coming years. Most of these look toward the future. What I tried to do, being trained as a historian, was to reverse it and look back at the past a little bit. And so I wanted to figure out sort of what the old Cold War could tell us about the new Cold Wars, or what one Twilight Struggle could tell us about others. And I think the obvious objection that probably arises to that sort of approach, or the obvious question at least, is the very correct point that the US-Soviet Cold War was not the same thing as the US-China competition or the US-Russia competition. And of course, they're not the same thing. Xi Jinping is not Stalin. Vladimir Putin is not Stalin. The nature of the international system is different today than it was in, say, 1947. The economic interconnections between the United States and China are both far deeper and far more complex than East-West economic ties ever were during the Cold War. And you could go on and on and on and really go down the list of ways in which the present doesn't seem to bear a huge resemblance to the past. But I still think there are at least three big reasons why it's worth studying the Cold War today. And the first is simply that we need to stop thinking about the Cold War as something that is totally unique and unprecedented in history. It's part of something bigger. It's part of this larger pattern of competition, rivalry, struggle between great powers that really goes back as far as recorded history. And it's interesting, of course, when George Marshall, who was then Secretary of State, was talking about the emerging Cold War in 1947, he basically said, you can't understand anything about what's happening today unless you've thought about the Peloponnesian War and the rivalry between Athens and Sparta. And so this understanding of the fact that you could go back and you could learn something about this larger phenomenon of great power rivalry by looking at the past was present in the calculations of US policymakers in the 1940s. And I think it's equally apt today. The second reason is that the Cold War is not the perfect analogy for the US-China or US-Russia competitions, but it's not a totally terrible one either. Today's competitions, they are ideological as well as geopolitical, just in the way that the Cold War was. They are struggles to shape world order that will have profound effects on the future of human freedom as well. That was true certainly during the Cold War. And winning the Cold War, waging it and ultimately winning it, required the United States to do a lot of things that it's going to have to do today. We had to create and manage unwieldy alliances. We had to define a long-term strategy that we could implement even as we adjusted it continually over time. We had to find ways of reconciling competition and cooperation and a variety of other things that I think have pretty close analogs in the US-China and US-Russia rivalries. And then the last reason I think it's worth looking systematically at the Cold War is that we're going to use Cold War history in one way or another. And so we might as well do it in a smart way. And so there is not an inexhaustible list of previous examples of decades-long great power competition in American history. Kori and I might argue a little bit about whether one counts the US-UK rivalry during the 19th century, and perhaps that's something that's interesting to talk about. But nonetheless, there is a small number of these examples. And so if we want to understand what the United States does well in long-term competition, it's natural for us to look at the Cold War, or what we do poorly as well. And then, of course, the Cold War, it also happens to be within the living memory of a lot of policymakers today. I'm sure Joe Biden, for instance, has a set of beliefs about the Cold War, good, bad, positive, negative, that structure how he reacts to certain events. And so policymakers are going to be using that understanding of the past one way or another. So let's do it systematically as opposed to doing it superficially. And so what I try to do in the book is identify 12 lessons that the United States can take away from the Cold War. I'm obviously not going to walk through all of them now, but they bear on things like, what makes for good long-term strategy? Why are allies so infuriating and so important at the same time? How should we think about the role of bureaucracy and things like that? And I guess the biggest takeaway from the book, and I'll stop here, is just really comes back to this issue of the value of history. And we've lived through an anomalous 25 to 30 years where great power competition was really conspicuous by its absence, although it was never really gone. It was just muted and suppressed by power disparities. And so long-term competition is really one of those things that only feels new or unfamiliar to us because it's so old. And so if we want to sort of rebuild intellectual muscle memory that's atrophied since the end of the Cold War, we can do worse than going back and looking at this previous case of it. And so that's what I try to do in the book. And why don't I stop there, and I look forward to comments, critiques, and good discussion.
So I am gunned up to talk about the book, but I want to give Zack the first shot at it. Zack, what are your thoughts on it? Where do you agree, disagree? What do you think is important about this work?
Well, first, it's great to be with both of you. I think it's a really important book, and Hal and I have had discussions over many years about this topic, and as Hal says, really differences, of course, between China and the Soviet Union, and between the United States after World War II and the United States today. But I think the book does a very nice job of drawing out not just the similarities, but also some of the differences in pretty concrete terms. The one area that I thought we might start off on, at least that I found particularly interesting in the book, is the area where you're the most critical of US strategy in the Cold War. And I think that's on the periphery, right? So, you make a pretty strong claim that the United States didn't always know what it was doing in all of these different areas, but for the most part, here and there, it managed to get it right. But on the periphery, you're fairly critical, and not just critical of certain times. It's not just Vietnam. It's actually critical about what happened on the periphery throughout the Cold War. And so I'd be particularly interested in this, and also in light of the fact that Kori has a wonderful New York Times piece out this morning talking about what the Biden administration clearly thinks is the periphery. So it strikes me that, in some ways, how the Biden administration is trying to be responsive to your concerns, that the United States was perhaps overly active in some parts of the periphery in the Cold War, and they're trying to decrease their activity, whether it's in Afghanistan or Ukraine, in areas that they think are peripheral. So I'd just be really interested to get into that debate about, what is the periphery, and how do we avoid making mistakes there?
Sure. So I'm happy to take a crack at that. I mean, I think that you've accurately characterized certainly the argument in the book, which is that the third world, or what we then called the third world, was the place where the United States probably struggled the most in Cold War competition, and it's because the competitive terrain was the competitive terrain was probably most favorable to the Soviet Union, or least favorable to the United States, at least. And it had to do a lot with the fact that the third world was undergoing one of the most, epochal political transformations in history through decolonization and the creation of new states, many of which were not particularly stable, many of which were looking for new political identities and new economic programs. It really opened up a lot of opportunities for the Soviet Union, particularly, and this is sort of the irony, in cases where people had only sort of experienced communist ideology from afar, right? The irony is that once a number of third world countries actually take up socialist economic programs in the 1960s and 1970s, they are such disasters that it helps discredit Soviet influence through the bloc. But before that happened, it really appeared as though the train was slanted in Moscow's direction. And so I think the United States was inherently challenged as a result of that. And the other problem that we struggled to figure out was, could you turn political change to your advantage? And so I think pretty much every U.S. administration thought that it would be a bad idea to get on the wrong side of third world nationalism in principle. And they also thought that nationalism was actually a pretty good buffer in the long term against communism, which was a more imperialistic ideology. The problem was that it was sort of one of these things like, in the long run, we're all dead, right? How do you get to the long run when short-term instability could open up opportunities for radical influence or for Soviet inroads? And that was what ultimately got us in traps in a lot of places, from Central America to sub-Saharan Africa. So, and of course, some of those traps become, very, very deep and very difficult to escape from, as we found in Vietnam. And that lesson, I think, as you mentioned, I think the Biden administration has learned, even overlearned that lesson quite well. And it seemed to be quite present in President Biden's calculations about Afghanistan, for instance, even going back to when he was Vice President Biden in 2009. I think there are reasonable arguments to be had about the strategic value of Afghanistan and the strategic stakes that the United States had there 20 years after 9/11. And I think a lot of it sort of comes down to what you think it would have cost the United States to avoid what the outcome that ultimately transpired, which I think everybody acknowledges was catastrophic. If it was going to be 5,000 troops on an ongoing basis, not sustaining a lot of casualties, really providing, support to Afghan forces, I would make the argument that sort of investment would have been worth it. If it was 20,000, I don't think it would have been. I think, interestingly, we're looking at Ukraine now. Ukraine, I don't think is part of the periphery. It may be peripheral to the U.S.-China competition, but certainly not to the U.S.-Russia competition. It's easy to lose track of the fact that Ukraine is actually a really big, really important, really strategically situated country. Again, I think there are sort of principled debates people can have about exactly how far the United States should go to try to prevent Russia from overrunning a large swath of that country. And the op-ed that you mentioned that Kori wrote, I think gets into that debate quite nicely. But by no stretch of the imagination is this a country whose fall or transformation would not have significant impacts on the balance of power in Europe. And I think if there was a major security crisis in Europe that resulted from a Russian invasion, it would have global implications as well. And so this is, I think Ukraine is far more central than Afghanistan was. And I think to his credit, while you can critique the Biden and I'll end here, the Biden administration's performance, I think they've increasingly realized that over the past 3 or 4 months.
So I want to pick up on the broader point about setting limits, because I love that the book is organized functionally around the big themes of Twilight Struggle, of great power competition. And I thought reading it that the most difficult needle to thread is figuring out when to set limits and what limits to set. Talk a little bit more about the cases you use there and how you would advise administrations to establish limits. Because I do think that's the hardest piece of a long-term struggle.
Yeah, this one was really interesting for me to think about, because in some ways the idea that you don't want competitions getting out of control, you want to impose limits on the danger that they create and the intensity of competition, that seems totally obvious, especially in a nuclear age. And at the same time, it was really difficult in the Cold War because there was always the fear that if you were too quick to negotiate, you might lose domestic support for whatever measures you needed to contain Soviet influence. You might lose Allied support. There were worries that the Soviets would simply use negotiations as a form of political warfare. They just use them to divide the free world and thus to thereby to conquer it.
The spirit of Geneva.
That's right. Yeah. And there was, the John Foster Dulles had this great quote that's basically, fear makes easy the task of diplomats. It was easy to hold NATO together, he thought, easier at least, when there was really a clear and present danger than when that danger started to fade a little bit. Nonetheless, there was a lot of productive diplomacy to establish limits during the Cold War, arms control agreements, agreements to limit the risk of surprise attacks. Sometimes these were tacit agreements. We came to a tacit agreement not to shoot each other's satellites down because we realized that would be destabilizing, or even agreements to deal with really important global problems like nuclear proliferation or smallpox, which was then killing about 2 million people a year in the developing world. I guess the advice I would give, or maybe the lessons that you can take away from this, is that you really need to think about diplomacy and even cooperation as tools of competition rather than substitutes for them. And so when we got in trouble, it was typically because we lost sight of the connection between some diplomatic initiative and our broader strategy, or we deceived ourselves into thinking that it could substitute for containment. Whereas I think the real role of diplomacy, it was to, tamp down tensions at the margin, reduce the risk of catastrophe a little bit. Sometimes it was to give us a strategic breather when we were winded after Vietnam, for instance. I think this was the original rationale for détente. And it could even just be a way of keeping your own public and your own allies engaged in the struggle by convincing them that you had exhausted the alternatives to competition. It's interesting. The failure of détente is actually what sets the stage for U.S. and Western resurgence during the 1980s. And so if you think of cooperation or diplomacy in those terms, I think it can be a powerful tool of a larger strategy.
Zach, go ahead, my friend.
Well, I did. That was one of the parts of the book that I found most interesting. Is you do come out quite clearly in favor of cooperating, right, with your adversary in certain areas. I think, for folks that have read a lot of your writing, this might have come as a little bit of a surprise, right? So I'm interested in, the degree to which you think that there are opportunities for cooperation, especially with the Chinese, on things like arms control, right?
Yeah.
Based on the lessons from the Cold War. It strikes me that, people have talked about this a lot, but that Beijing doesn't seem at all willing to have these discussions. And, are there lessons about when the Soviets were really willing to come to the table and have these debates that might be applicable? How do you think about this?
Yeah, we just need a Cuban Missile Crisis first. So is that more in keeping with my persona, Zach? So no, I mean I think there are 2 or 3 areas where, in theory, we would like to have some degree of cooperation, or at least manage tensions with China. And so one would be on sort of transnational issues where we think we both have an interest in dealing with them: climate change, pandemics, that sort of thing. And then the second would be sort of in the stability agenda, right? And so arms control, encounters at sea, things that could perhaps take the competition out of control, and we'd like to impose limits there. I think on pandemics, I think we're destined to be disappointed. I think the CCP has literally zero interest in promoting greater global transparency and cooperation on pandemics, because they've given us literally zero cooperation on this one for some obvious reasons. Climate, maybe a little bit more down the road. Right now, Beijing is still trying to insist on linkage, right? And so if we want them to cooperate with us, to save the planet, then we have to go soft on Xinjiang and Taiwan and Tibet and 10 other things first. I think the Biden administration has said they're not going to do that. And so we're at a little bit of an impasse at the moment, where I think both sides are hoping that they can impose their preference set on the other, and we'll see how that plays out. On arms control and stability, I think this actually is an interesting parallel to the Cold War. I mean, the Soviet Union had zero interest in these sort of talks until they had reached something close to strategic parity with the United States. And why would we cap our buildup short of where you are? The Chinese have certainly indicated that they are moving in the same direction, right? So the current projections are that they are looking to become a nuclear peer of some sort by the early 2030s. But they have resolutely resisted getting drawn into arms control talks with the U.S. or the U.S. and Russia. And this alludes to a third problem, I guess, which is that we may need a totally different framework for arms control in this era than we did during the Cold War. I mean, I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense for the U.S. and Russia to do bilateral arms control agreements that leave China on the outside. At the same time, nobody's come up with the formula for getting China into those processes yet. And so I think we're probably, several years, a decade away from the point where either the Chinese decide that it's in their interest to come into this, or, we find ways of inducing them to come in.
So staying on this subject of China, Hal, you describe in the book, you say regional primacy is less a destination than a springboard for China. And that's an interesting and, as you know, contested conclusion, even within our foreign and defense team at AEI. How does your policy advice differ if China's ambitions are limited and regional versus global?
So this is a great question, and I'd actually be interested to get Zach's thoughts on it too, because I'm having bad flashbacks to a time when I think Zach and I were trying to write a paper together, and we kept crossing out each other's language on exactly this subject. So at the risk of inflicting trauma on both of us, it might be interesting to revisit that debate. So on the question of what would you do if China's ambitions were limited? I actually don't know that you would do anything different. And this may be a counterintuitive answer for 2 reasons. And so one is that depending on how China defined regional primacy, that regional primacy could still be quite threatening to the United States. And so if China defined regional primacy in a way that involved, kicking us out of our alliance relationships in East Asia, dominating the military balance of power, everywhere out to the Central Pacific, orienting the economies of the most dynamic region on earth toward China and locking the United States out of some of those markets, that would be a pretty serious threat to American interests, at least as we have traditionally defined them in the past. I mean, nobody thought that Japan was capable of global primacy in the late 1930s, and yet we were willing to risk and ultimately fight a major war to deny them the regional primacy that they sought. So that's one reason. The second reason, though, is that I don't know how you could ever be sure that China's ambitions were limited, even if the Chinese didn't have those ambitions today, right? And so it might be that what seems like a reasonable limit on Chinese ambitions in Beijing will come to seem less reasonable once China has accomplished some intermediary objectives. And so it may be that once China runs the United States out of Asia, it says, well, now we can think about projecting our power more broadly. That would hardly be unprecedented in history. And so I guess I'm a little bit of a pessimist on this issue in terms of what it would mean and how you could even tell. But I'd be interested to hear what you guys think on this.
Zach, I'd love to know what you think about this question, especially since you're thinking so creatively about intersecting circles of alliances.
I think this is one of the really tough challenges out there, right? Which is that if you look at China today, of course, it seems like China's interests are much more regional, certainly than the Soviet interests were in much of the Cold War, right? China doesn't have the kind of ideology that the Soviets had. It doesn't have the kind of presence in many places overseas. It has a big economic presence, but it doesn't have the kind of political influence. And I think, one of the real challenges here, as Hal said, is it's just going to be impossible to know where the Chinese are going to end up in this regard. I'm reminded that in 1888, Theodore Roosevelt says that he's very against colonialization and he thinks it's immoral. And then a decade later, the United States is in the Philippines. And oh, by the way, it's Roosevelt himself making those decisions. So I just think that at the end of the day, it's hard for rising powers to know exactly how far their objectives are going to shift as they rise. Which doesn't mean that we should necessarily assume that China is going to have global ambitions. And Hal and Jake Sullivan wrote a good piece on this. What was that, Hal, two or 3 years ago?
A couple of years ago, yeah.
Yeah, about the question about whether China might first look to obtain its regional objectives and then go global, or whether China might just go global first. And I think it probably depends a little bit on how much pushback China sees in the region. If there's really severe pushback in the region, I think China might, either withdraw a little bit or go the complete opposite direction, which is say, look, we're getting pushback from groups like the Quad, from Japan and India and Australia. We might as well jump over the Quad and look more towards Africa and Latin America and Eastern Europe and these kinds of areas. If there isn't that kind of pressure in East Asia, then I would think we'll see China try and consolidate power in that region and then maybe look further afield. But I think this is one of the really tough strategic questions for the United States is, and it comes back to what we were discussing at the beginning, what is the periphery, right? If you think that this competition is mostly going to occur in Asia, then, Ukraine really is the periphery. But if you think that the competition is about getting allies and partners on board with a broad strategy that's maybe not just about China, but also a little bit about authoritarianism and about China and Russia together, then actually Ukraine's very important. And I don't think we've really made clear as, folks in the strategic community, which side of that debate we all come out on.
Two other points I'd add into the conversation. The first is that, as Hal mentioned, the end of the colonial era and the independence movements in Africa, in Asia, around Latin America, those created opportunities for the Soviets. And so we shouldn't just look at it as a push function of what China or the Soviet Union were choosing. We should also do the net assessment that there were huge opportunities for, as Hal pointed out, relatively small cost gains, because the United States was aligned with the former colonial powers that made our rhetoric about human rights and political sovereignty seem hypocritical. So one is the circumstances which created those opportunities. I'm not sure those opportunities outside a relatively small number of politically corrupt countries exist in the same way for China, or have the same kind of ideological heft as Soviet influence throughout Africa did, for example. And the second point I would add is that, Zack, I love that you use Theodore Roosevelt's example, because as you know, I love the 19th century American history. But the domestic ideology of the United States really matters, because you're right, with the Spanish-American War, we become a traditional colonial power in the Philippines, in Cuba, and yet it doesn't really take hold. It starts corroding after about 15 years because it's such an affront to the political ideology of the country. And I think one of the challenges China poses is that there is not that contradiction between their domestic ideology and a global push for power and for subjugation of other countries. We have some great questions coming in on the chat, so I'm going to go to them. The first is a lot of tension in the gray zone of late, but I've never heard of a leader directly warn caution on any issue that it might lead to nuclear war, as Putin recently did. How should this be taken? Hal, that one's for you.
Yeah, interesting question. This is not the first time that Putin has done this. I think it was back in 2014, 2015. He announced that he had put Russian strategic nuclear forces on alert when Russia seized Crimea from Ukraine. And so the sort of the nuclear card is one that Putin has played a number of times. I mean, I think there's a couple of ways of interpreting this. Neither of them are super reassuring. One is simply that the threat of asymmetric nuclear escalation is really important to Russia, because Russia, while it has conventional military dominance over Ukraine or over Georgia or Moldova, it doesn't have conventional military dominance vis-a-vis NATO and the United States. And so the Russians worry that if they got into a scrape with NATO, U.S. and particularly U.S. conventional operations could pose a pretty serious threat to the Russian homeland. And so what they may be trying to do is sort of preemptively deter NATO from responding to a Russian incursion in Ukraine by reminding people in Europe and the United States that this sort of propensity, or this propensity to threaten asymmetric escalation exists, and try to take advantage of the fact that I think most people assume that Russia has more intense interests in Ukraine than, say, the United States does. The other way, though, to think about it, which I think has become more worrying for reasons I'll explain, is that Putin clearly thinks that the West and the United States in particular are risk averse. And that gives him an advantage in what, John Foster Dulles might have called brinkmanship, right? And so if he can, make crazy threats about using nuclear weapons, it will instill caution in the West and force us to back down. Now that can be a calculated strategy, but I mean, one of the interesting questions about the Ukraine crisis in particular is, how isolated is Putin right now? He really hasn't been seeing a ton of people during COVID. Xi Jinping, I think, was it was the first time he had gone out of the country in a while, and there has been some talk about maybe he's not getting as good advice, or he's not listening to advice as well as before. The U.S. government has leaked some information suggesting that may be the case as well, and so there's probably a little bit of reason for concern about whether Putin may be a little bit more erratic now than he has been in the past, if not by design, then simply by nature. And so I think it's a fairly worrying issue, even though I certainly wouldn't expect a Ukraine crisis to lead to nuclear use.
So then, Zach, go ahead, my friend.
Just a quick point on this too, which is, the United States seldom directly threatens nuclear war, but we do sometimes imply it. And I think a good example in the gray zone is almost a decade ago now, in 2014. You'll remember that China was increasing the pressure on Japan around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands and the East China Sea. And this pressure was going up and up and up, and people were really growing more and more worried about this pressure and the inability of the US-Japan alliance to respond effectively to it. And back in 2014, President Obama made very clear that the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands actually fell under Article 5 of the US-Japan Security Treaty because they're administered by Japan. And he didn't explicitly say that we might use nuclear weapons, but I think it was quite clear that he was saying that, look, the US-Japan alliance is really important to the United States, and this pressure is a serious threat. And it turns out that if you look back, the Chinese didn't entirely back off, but the temperature has gone down significantly over the last 8 years compared to the couple of years before that. So I do think that the US can use these threats of escalation in a way to tamp down some of the gray zone pressure, but it has to be in cases where there's a serious chance that the US would actually escalate in that way, right? And I think in the US-Japan alliance, you can imagine that potentially being the case. It's hard to imagine in Ukraine, Philippines, even Taiwan. It might be tough. I think that makes these sorts of threats particularly difficult.
Yeah, can I just come back briefly on this?
Yes.
Sorry, I don't mean to get in the way of the next question, but this is so interesting. So because the challenge that we face now is that the conventional balance has eroded so badly at the periphery of our alliance commitments, or our quasi commitments in the case of Taiwan, that the United States could plausibly find itself in a scenario where a US president is told, if you want to prevent China from overrunning Taiwanese defenses and getting 100,000 troops on shore, you got to use low yield nuclear weapons against ports and fleets and other things that are sort of directly supporting the invasion attempt, because the rest of our conventional power in the Western Pacific has been crippled by the Chinese missile barrage. And so that's really all that you're left with. In theory, you could see something similar like in the Baltic states, where the Russians have a pretty severe local advantage. And, our commitments, right? NATO is under the US nuclear umbrella, a little bit more ambiguous with respect to Taiwan. This is the sort of thing that the United States threatened to do regularly during the Cold War. I mean, we always said that we would fight a nuclear war rather than lose a conventional one in Europe, for instance. The challenge is that I don't know that threat is nearly as credible today as it was back then, right? It was one thing to threaten to incinerate the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union was going to overrun Western Europe. We actually probably would have incinerated our own allies at that point rather than see them harnessed to the Soviet industrial base. It's a different story over Taiwan or Estonia or countries that are important but less central.
So this is the bedeviling problem of the Eisenhower administration's strategy. And if you go back and read their NSC debates about the crafting and judgments on the basic national security policy, which was their version of the NSS, this problem of what do you do if a local ally is incapable of conventionally defending itself, but we are not committed enough to cross the nuclear threshold. And it is the piece of strategy that they can never nail down. And I think understandably, because there's not actually a good answer to that. It is the fundamental weakness of our strategy. So I want to put this next question to both of you, because it's an area both of you do interesting and important work. And the question is, how can the Ukraine crisis reveal lessons for how America can prevent a disaster in Taiwan? Hal, you first.
All right, but fair warning, Kori, I think we may turn this one back on you as well, since you've been writing about it too. But I'll go first. So I wrote something on this, I guess, earlier this week, and I argued that we have two framings of the Taiwan-Ukraine connection that are both too simplistic. And so the first is if Ukraine goes today, Taiwan goes tomorrow framing, right? And the second is that there's no connection between these two things, and Ukraine is totally irrelevant to what happens in Taiwan. Neither one is right, of course, for reasons that we can talk about. But so the argument, the question that becomes then, like, what have we learned from the Ukraine crisis that might be relevant in helping to protect Taiwan from Chinese pressure? And I think there are a handful of things. And so one, the Ukraine crisis has sort of been an interesting test case in whether we can preload economic sanctions that we would then hurl at an aggressor when they cross the line. I think, that would probably play a pretty important role in a Taiwan contingency, not necessarily as a replacement for a direct defense of the island, but perhaps as a complement to it. And it reveals both sort of good and bad things about that. So, we clearly have been able to get some agreement with the Europeans in particular on sanctions, but not on the harshest sanctions. And so when you look at sort of what the Biden administration would do after a Russian invasion, you're probably hitting the Russians immediately with unilateral sanctions and then rounding up whatever you can get multilaterally. I think that might be something that would happen in the China case as well. Just one more lesson I'll mention before turning it over to Zack. If you're going to move forces forward, it's better to do it before the crisis, right, rather than during the crisis, because you can find yourself in the escalation trap, where once tensions get very high, it comes to be seen as escalatory to move your own forces forward to help defend a friend, and so you can be paralyzed. And so if the United States is planning on, operating on some of those southernmost islands that Japan controls that are only 100 miles or so from Taiwan, or if it thinks it might need to get somewhat larger contingents of forces on Taiwan itself in a crisis, we need to be laying the groundwork for that now, because it will be too late and sort of too high temperature once the crisis starts.
Zack.
This is such a fascinating topic. So I think, the place I start is that Jake Sullivan has explicitly said that there's a difference between Taiwan and Ukraine. And if you go back to mid-December, he gave some remarks in which he said, look, there's no Ukraine Relations Act, right? And I think his implication there was that the Taiwan Relations Act gives the United States some responsibilities in a Taiwan crisis, although he didn't spell out exactly what those might be. And there's been a big debate about, whether the US should have some sort of ambiguous commitment or a more clear commitment. But I think the Biden approach has been to say, look, Kori, you talked about this in the Times today, that the US just isn't going to commit its own forces in a Ukraine situation. But now the tricky part is, the Biden team also has to make clear that it might actually commit its forces in a Taiwan contingency, even though there's also no treaty alliance there. And I think this is really tough. And, the Biden team clearly doesn't want to abandon strategic ambiguity. They think it is a good thing for the US not to be entirely clear about what it's doing on Taiwan. But I think this gets harder given what's going on in Ukraine, right? Because you have sort of an ambiguous commitment to Ukraine and you chose to do nothing. So there's a risk that you might say, well, you have an ambiguous commitment to Taiwan, and wouldn't you also choose to do nothing there? Especially if the risks of escalation over Taiwan might be even greater than over Ukraine. So I think this is a really tough challenge. The other dynamic that I find fascinating here is how other allies and partners outside the region respond to US actions in Ukraine. There's a great academic piece on this by Tongfi Kim and Luis Simon that basically talks about this as a trade-off between reputation and prioritization. So take how, for example, Taiwan might look at a Ukraine crisis right now. Yes, there's part of, I think, the population in Taipei that's saying, well, we want to see the US be very tough, right? Have a reputation for toughness, which means the US should be quite tough in Ukraine, even if that means having to go to war. But then there's another push in the other direction that says, well, we want to make sure that Taiwan is the priority if there's going to be a conflict somewhere in the world. And draining resources off into Ukraine is actually damaging for Taiwan's cause. I think these trade-offs are just incredibly difficult and highlights the very fine line that this administration or any administration has to walk when it comes to these non-treaty ally commitments and what they mean for other countries that are looking at the US reaction to them.
So I would agitate on the point that there is no Taiwan Relations Act for Ukraine, which is certainly true, but there is a Budapest memorandum where we commit to the sovereignty and security of Ukraine, about which we have done nothing before or since 2014. And so I do think there is reputational damage. And what our adversaries are doing so incredibly well, and none better than Vladimir Putin, is plying the gap between the grandiosity of our statements and our actual willingness to do things. It encourages challenges. And by being so clear that American military forces off the table in Ukraine, it can create the expectation that if the Chinese dial up the pressure on Taiwan, we will want to make the same sort of clear-cut declaration. It encourages the testing of the proposition, and I think that's actually corrosive to deterrence. Okay, a long and interesting question. In the Cold War, the US was willing to support even right-wing dictatorships in places like Latin America, provided those governments were anti-communist and could assist the US in its rivalry with the Soviets. However, with China, the US has tried to stick with strategic ambiguity in its relationship with Taiwan, which is a strong democracy, market economy, and important technological partner. Does America's reluctance of supporting Taiwan like it supported those right-wing dictatorships allow Beijing to believe that the US really has qualms about supporting Taiwan? Does it also give Beijing the idea that US support of Taiwan remains ambiguous because the US fears angering China? And I want you both in on this one. Hal?
Yeah, so I think this is interesting. And I would associate myself with the comments that Zack made about Taiwan and our ambiguous commitment there and his last response. I mean, I guess I would say I don't think necessarily that strategic ambiguity is the issue in two different respects. And so the first way is that I think while the Biden administration doesn't want to ditch strategic ambiguity because they do worry about provoking a pretty significant backlash, whether in the Taiwan Strait or elsewhere, they've actually been about as clear as they can be within the framework of the current policy that the US would not sit idly by as Taiwan was attacked. And so President Biden has outright said this a couple of times. It then gets cleaned up, after the fact, but you do it once, it's a slip. You do it twice, it may be deliberate. And I think the Biden administration has also, again, while they're not walking away from the one China policy or anything like that, they're kind of turning China's salami slicing strategy against it by gradually expanding US diplomatic, military, economic ties with Taiwan. And so, kind of like, 5 years after China started slicing in the South China Sea, we wake up to a different reality. 5 years from now, I think the US-Taiwan relationship is going to look significantly different than it does today, even though we presumably still won't have sort of formal diplomatic recognition. So that's maybe the good way in which ambiguity is not the problem. The bad way in which ambiguity is not the problem is it's not so much, I think, our declaratory policy that it's in doubt. It's our capabilities that are in doubt at the moment. And so my hunch, and I draw a lot on the thinking of AEI colleagues like Zack and Oriana Mastro and thinking about this, is that the Chinese probably have to assume that we would help Taiwan in a major crisis. I think where what they might doubt whether we are able to do so effectively, simply because the balance of power has shifted so much, and because we've been so slow to do the things that we've known we needed to do for a decade to make the United States better able to deal with Chinese aggression in the Western Pacific. Everything from dispersing and hardening bases to buying more long-range strike and things that Zack can talk about in much greater detail than I can. And so if we have to, if we were to simply make a stronger statement of our support for Taiwan, I don't know that buys us an extra pound of deterrence as opposed to strengthening our capability to actually help Taiwan.
Yeah. Zack.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, I think there's a broader tension here, which how you really get into nicely in the book, which is, how much do you focus on sort of geostrategy and how much do you focus on these values issues? And I think you make a very convincing case that actually the values issues matter, but they can't be the only factor, right? You have to have a mix, and you're going to turn each lever up at different times and, turn it down at other times. Here I think Taiwan is a really tricky issue. So in 10 minutes, I think the administration is going to release an Indo-Pacific strategy. That strategy is probably not going to talk a lot about values. And it's for a good reason, which is that at the end of the day, if you're trying to appeal to most Asian allies and partners, well, some of them are democratic, but not all of them, right? If you look at the Summit for Democracy, only 3 of the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations were actually invited to the summit, right? So the US was saying the other 7 are actually non-democratic. So as much as we like to talk about democracy, in some ways we have a political warfare challenge here, which Hal goes into really nicely in the book, which is that the more you talk about this sort of importance of democracy and political warfare, the more you put your opponent on their back foot, which is great. Especially, I think if you look last week at the Russian and Chinese joint statement in which they try to claim again that they are fully fledged democracies and more effective at democracy than actual democracies, this seems to get under their skin. But it also gets under the skin of some of our friends who we need to get on board. And I think this is just an incredibly difficult challenge. So you can't just talk about the importance of democracy when it comes to Taiwan. You also have to talk about, the geostrategic logic of why the United States cares about Taiwan. But the challenge of doing that is that, as Eli Ratner, the Assistant Secretary for the Indo-Pacific at the Defense Department, found out recently, when you talk about the geostrategic logic of why the United States cares about Taiwan, well, you seem to be suggesting that there's no way that the United States would ever let China gain control of Taiwan, which then could be seen as sort of undermining the idea of a one China policy. So this is just incredibly, incredibly difficult. And I don't know that we have the right answer. Hal and I probably have slightly different views about the degree to which political warfare is valuable, but I think this is a really, really difficult challenge.
So we have still questions in the queue that I might try to get to in our last few minutes, but I don't want to crowd out giving Hal the chance to talk about what I think is a really important and so far unmentioned aspect of his book, which is the extent to which this is a systemic challenge. And it's a test of systems. It's not just ideology. It's not just capability. It's also about the operating system of the international order. And how you have been such an important voice on this part of the strategy. Talk about that in the book.
Sure. So maybe there's a couple different ways of looking at this, but the one I guess I would focus on is the more you look at the history of great power rivalry, not just today, not just during the Cold War, but over hundreds of years, the more you come to realize that countries' preferences for the international order and what it should look like are really closely related to their preferences for domestic order within their own countries. Right? I mean, that was clearly and explicitly true of the Soviet Union, which argued that its form of government should go to the ends of the earth. It's true of the United States, by the way. I mean, the reason that we think, the reason that we like a more democratic world is that we think we will be more secure and prosperous and influential in such a world because it corresponds to our own values. It'll be morally better as well, of course. And I think this is maybe the part of the contemporary rivalries it's very much debated today. And you get really stark divides over whether Chinese foreign policy is ultimately driven by the nature of the system or by something else. I think clearly it is. I mean, I think that there's a reason that the CCP is so uncomfortable in a world led by a democratic superpower, because they worry that world could ultimately be fatal to the illiberal order within China. And so when you see China propping up dictators, when you see it trying to rewrite the rules of international organizations or change our understanding of democracy, in human rights, it's because there is this very close connection between how countries govern themselves at home and the vision of order they seek in the world.
Outstanding. I'm going to try and force into our last couple of minutes 2 more questions. So I'm going to pair them together, go first to Zack, and then give Hal the last word. Here are the 2 questions. Question 1, do you think both the Ukraine and Taiwan crises are examples of Russia and China wanting to maintain a buffer zone? And if so, is this a valid concern with long-range weapons? So has military innovation obviated the concept of buffer zones? And the second question to you both, what level of defense spending is needed to compete with China and Russia? Zack.
Boy, that second question is hard. So I'm going to take the first one and leave the second one to Hal. So I do think we're seeing both Russia and China look to establish some sort of sphere of influence, right? And certainly Putin has been pretty explicit about this, and you don't have to look far for what he's done in Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan to see that he believes that Russia should have a sphere of influence that should be really its own area. That, you know, the United States, the West doesn't interfere in that area. And he wants to renegotiate along those terms. I think on the Chinese side, it's something a bit different. There is no way that China is going to have that kind of buffer zone because China's borders are with big, powerful states, right? You know, India, Japan, Korea, Russia, right? And yes, you've got Southeast Asia, which is a little bit weaker in terms of power. But at the end of the day, there's no way for China to get that kind of buffer zone. So I think the two are in a slightly different situation. But for those who are interested in more on this, our friend Tom Wright wrote a great book about regional orders and how they play into global orders a few years ago. And I think it's a fantastic read on this exact point.
So, Zack, I object to you not answering the defense spending question, given that you are one of the country's leading experts on it. But Hal, you get the last words, my friend.
Well, I'll try to answer that second one. I mean, it depends on what you want to do, obviously, but I think it's become pretty clear that the level of defense spending that we have is not commensurate with the commitments that we have. And so I don't know how you can maintain multiple theaters of commitments if you have a defense strategy premised on only being able to fight one war at a time, for instance. And so now that's not to prejudge the answer, right? And so you could decide that we're just going to get rid of some of the commitments. You could decide that we are going to appease, not in a pejorative sense, some rivals so that we can concentrate on others. That's what the United Kingdom did, as Kori explains in her book, when they started appeasing the United States to focus on other concerns closer to home. Or you can build up your capabilities to try to make good on your commitments. I don't think that you can sort of muddle through forever. We've been trying to muddle through for about 15 years now. And I think that's probably going to get us burned at some point.
And on that optimistic note, Hal Brands, thank you for this outstanding book, which is really important. And thank you more broadly for how much you help the rest of us to understand the nature of international order and how to craft strategies. Zack Cooper, thank you so much for all you contribute to the Foreign and Defense team, teaching us about China and about alliances as well. And gentlemen, thank you for the fun of this conversation.
Thank you, Kori.